And welcome to the webinar, State of the IVD Industry 2024. We think it's a fitting time to talk about in vitro diagnostics. Of course, we've just had the ADLM convention in Chicago, 18,000 folks there. That's always a good leaping point for discussions of the industry. It's a big industry vendor conference. That was last month, and people coming back from summer vacations figured it's a good time to wrap up what happened, what's happened since. LTDs and the FDA final rule. Lots to talk about there, particularly from an in vitro diagnostics perspective. So we hear so much from the lab perspective on this issue, where they're going to be facing some complexities and paperwork, to say the least. And let's hear about it from an in vitro diagnostics point of view. Our panelists will talk about that. And also COVID. We're getting away from that overhang of COVID revenues and getting back to a more place that we're familiar with, and where base core testing businesses have to survive on their own, and what's going on there and what new tests are available. So these are all things we're going to talk about. I'm not going to do it alone, but to introduce myself, I'm Bruce Carlson, used to be with Kalorama. I am heading up On IVD newsletter, ionivd.com. You can sign up for it there. I'm also on LinkedIn. We'll do market research reports. We have an infectious disease report coming out. I'm joined by also Frank Crissione from Broadbranch Advisors, and he's going to have some interesting things to say in just a bit. Bob McGonigal, we are so happy to have him from CAP Today, and Lawrence Warden from IVD Logix. Welcome to our panel, and welcome everyone. How are we going to do it? Quick market discussion, very quick. Some notable trends in the industry. We'll talk about new products, vendor strategies that we've seen. We'll talk a little bit about ADLM and what we saw at 2024 meeting in Chicago. Of course, we'll talk about LTDs, again, from that IVD perspective. And Q&A, we should have time for that, and we'll answer your questions the best that we can. I wanted to go into just a little bit about the IVD market opportunity. You see different estimates of what the size of the IVD market is. I'm not even including all of them. Some I think are too low or too high, but anywhere from like $85 billion to $102 billion of market there. I put the market at On IVD at $96 billion, growing to $109 billion in 5 years, not including glucose. We put that into the medical device category at this time. I do not, On IVD doesn't publish an IVD market research report at this time. We do have an infectious disease. This is based on about 25 different categories, including infectious disease and all other types of IVD testing. So that's where we see it. Growth, you're seeing estimates between 2 on the low side, 5 and on the very high side. I'd put it at 2.4%. COVID restraining growth, consolidation, other trends restraining growth, reimbursement challenges, restraining growth, and then a lot of new tests and interesting things, point of care, expanding growth, and you come out at that. Where do you see growth specifically? Respiratory, sexually transmitted infections, most PLC. All the neurology tests are going to be big. Alzheimer's, particular genetic tests, despite some challenges there. Faster growth in other categories. COVID, chemistry, non-microbiology, immunoassays obviously are going to be a little bit slower growth. So that's one trend that I notice. This is just me speaking with a few of my trends, and what I'm going to do, and then Frank's going to do following me, is just sort of a little bit of appetizers, and then we'll have our chefs dig into the main meal of everything going on. But one of the things I noticed is you can't avoid a little bit more challenging market. In many ways, a return to 2019. What do I mean by that? You don't have the excess revenues of COVID, obviously. COVID revenues, declining from their highs. But therefore, you see a return to some of the age-old questions about decentralization, centralization, antimicrobial stewardship, and other things, with a twist. And the twist is a lot more molecular systems installed base as a result of that COVID epidemic, and not all are going away. New technologies being used. LTD final rule. My commentary is just I don't see, one might expect a level of celebration in IVD. I don't see that in a broad fashion. That's not to say companies are not assessing where there might be opportunities to strike there and gain more revenue, but they also have problems from LDT if you're an IVD vendor because your customer is the lab, and anything that hurts your customer might hurt you. And then also IVD vendors sell to LTDs. So all of those things, to labs doing LTDs, I should say. So all these things have to be considered in that factor. I went to ADLM. I noticed, for instance, with high sensitivity troponin, I had 20 years, you're seeing not so much the challenging of that marker, but maybe we can put that marker in a context. Also noticed the strong contract manufacturing presence at ADLM, the former AACC. As always, a good contract manu meeting, and a couple of notable innovators like for hemolysis tests, for blood gas tests that automatically checks for hemolysis. So if there's going to be some tainting of your test results while you're doing a rapid test in the emergency department. Werfen has that. I noted that's just one of many that I noted, and I'm sure the panelists will have more. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Frank Crissione from Broadbranch Advisors, who has some more thoughts. Frank?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Bruce. So I'm going to really quickly talk a little bit about ADLM. And I think the main takeaway here is that innovation was happening, but it was taking on a little bit of a subtle form. So at the top of the page, you can see some of the areas where we identified some of those key innovations, so syndromic panel testing, all the way to clinical chemistry and automation. The common thread that was through all of these, there were a couple. So first, rapid results and bringing all of this testing closer to the patient was something that was focused on by a lot of the molecular people. So for instance, you had a Diasorin there, I believe it was the Liaison Flex. They were talking about syndromic panel testing and really ramping up speeds. And then particularly you had BioFire, their Spotfire, claiming that they could do a syndromic panel test in around 15 minutes. So both of those are really trying to decrease the occupancy time in hospital beds and also decrease the amount of time that doctors will be getting results. So all of that is going to be leading to positive patient outcomes. The next thing that we did notice as basically an opportunity is this simplification and streamlining of laboratory processes. So all the way from accessioning, sample handling, testing, and analysis, all of that is going into a sort of phase where humans are being taken out of that equation. And that's to answer two problems. First, clinical labs are reporting that there is a shortage of labor available. And in addition to that, everyone likes the removal of human error. So really, these sort of advances are trying to basically improve how we get a sample to the testing arena. Now, there are a couple of challenges that we did also see in terms of commonalities from ADLM. One was that there was a very large presence of offshore competitors. So in the near term, that's not really an area of concern because most of these competitors don't have FDA clearance. However, in the long term, as they do begin to apply for FDA clearance, they might have an actual substantial threat to some of the larger players in North America. And then the common thread, and I think that this is an age-old problem for every IVD manufacturer, is the navigation of reimbursement and dealing with insurance. So yes, you might come out with an amazing test. You might want to place this new test in every clinical laboratory, but will doctors order it? Will insurance companies reimburse it? That is going to be a major question. And there are a couple of strategies that these types of manufacturers can take in terms of understanding how to navigate that landscape. So that's again, shameless plug for Broadbranch Advisors. Those are some of the areas that we investigate. So in terms of how do you fit into figuring out a strategy for a clinical reimbursement strategy, going into those offshore competitors. Are they actual threats, or are they going to be something that's a little bit more long-term? So again, all of that is something that from the manufacturer side difficult to see, but from an outside perspective, you will shine a little bit of light in those areas where manufacturers don't necessarily have a clear line of sight. All right, so Bruce, let's go on to the 800-pound gorilla that I believe everyone is aware of, and that's the LDT ruling. So we could say that in terms of the long-term sort of strategy, yes, that the LDT ruling is fairly clear, but in the near term, there is a bit of uncertainty. And so what we're really trying to recognize is how do we create a bespoke path to preparedness? And so we've identified around 3 areas that are critical in order to creating that sort of pathway to either opportunity or sustainability. First, identification. So how much of your product portfolio as a manufacturer is actually going to be affected by the LDT ruling? Comparing those tests that are going to be grandfathered versus those that have a limited grace period. There are a couple of other things that factor into this. What are your competitors offering that could basically take the place of your LDT? And also, what is your developmental pipeline? Do you have something in the pipeline that is going to be replacing the LDT that is no longer allowed? Next is evaluation. And so this is a tricky part because I think manufacturers are going to have a little bit of a tough time trying to recognize or trying to calibrate how their portfolio is going to be impacted by the LDT ruling. Some might say that there is going to be a minimal impact and are not very much worried about it. Others might have a very large proportion of their portfolio that is going to be affected by this. And that's where the competitor analysis needs to come in. If your portfolio is going to be affected by this, how much of a threat are those competitors going to be in terms of replacing or stepping in to that gap that your portfolio now has? And finally, execution. How do you implement a plan that is going to lead to achievable results? And so that's, again, where we come in with the help of strategic planning, identification of how to most effectively deploy your resources, and then finally future-proofing any of those plans that you might have. All of this does take a different form depending on what type of organization and what type of LDT, what type of IVD manufacturer you are. So of course, none of these solutions are going to be the same for a broad stroke of IVD manufacturers. That's why it is critical to understand in the near term if there are certain steps that can be taken in order to basically set you on that path to success in the future, or if you're just going to cross your fingers and wait it out. So with that, I think that basically summarizes a little bit of what I wanted to talk about. And I think this is the prime opportunity to open it up to the rest of the panel. And Bruce, if you don't mind, maybe we start, like I said, with that 800-pound gorilla and talk about LDTs.
Yeah, no, that's great, Frank. Thank you very much. And so one of the so I mentioned very briefly that I didn't see, the sort of popping of champagne corks and the like, just at the announcement of the rule among IVD, because I think it brings some uncertainties to their business as well, depending who they are. Are they a Thermo? Are they a Diasorin? Are they a Roche? That's gonna be three different scenarios for those companies. I note that AdVmed, is their kind of group. So while AMP and ACLA are suing right now to remove the rule, AdVmed, even there, I was supportive of the rule in there when it was announced, but I wouldn't say they certainly didn't think of it as a final solution. It was more of a let's hopefully Congress can patch up some legislation. That's what we really want. So it's interesting to see. Any thoughts there quickly about the LTD rule, from an IVD perspective?
Well, I'd start by saying never has the VALID Act been held in such high esteem as in the wake of the FDA's final rule. I mean, I remember when no one seemed to like the VALID Act. A few manufacturers did, a few societies did, like CAP, but everyone else was opposed. And in the divided Congress, of course, it had no chance of passage. Now there's a lot of people who want to see it go back into the Congress. And I think that's really the burden of both of these lawsuits that you've seen is both groups are arguing that FDA really has no legal basis to enforce this rule as written and implemented. And so we'll have to see how that winds its way through the courts. The two cases, as you know, have been combined in a single before a single bench in Texas. Both venues were pretty carefully chosen by the plaintiffs, and there's a lot of amicus briefs in the offing and in preparation. Those are due next week, or no, due in October 10th now, given the combination of the two cases. But this is a real reality. I think you're right, Bruce, and I'll just say this briefly. Nobody who sells things to any customer can be gleeful when the customer is in a lot of pain. And the labs that are faced with the LDT burden look to be in a lot of pain, in particular as those laboratories have some very, very critical tests, critical to their very mission as a laboratory, which are LDTs. For example, I was on a webinar with the head of molecular path at Geisinger just 2 days ago. She said 90% of all their molecular tests at Geisinger are LDTs. So no one's going to be very gleeful around that. Certainly not major vendors such as Roche or Thermo, or we can all name the names that find that to be a very important system to do business with.
Lawrence, any thoughts on that?
They're very different LDTs. They're the LDTs that are forced because you're using a different specimen type than was included in the FDA clearance, or you're running your extraction on a different platform than was contemplated by the manufacturer in submitting their FDA clearance. But then you have the tests that don't exist in a commercial form that the laboratory has to create to meet patient demand, and you also have to think about, the laboratory sections that are affected by this. Chemistry, immunoassay, hematology, not so much, but molecular genetics, flow cytometry, mass spec, very much so. And these are the labs where 90% of their tests are LDTs. And in our discussions with these labs, what we're hearing is right now is, still confusion and apprehension, but the labs are starting to prioritize or triage their test menus and ask, which of these would I have to register? Which of these would I like to, but I'm going to just try to send them out instead? And then which ones am I just going to not bother with because I can get by without offering them? So, I mean, it's a different landscape out there depending on what kind of LDT it is and what your particular lab specialty is.
Yeah, that's interesting. So like, Frank, to your point, then some vendors are starting to think about too, like, okay, how do I prioritize essentially what those labs might make a decision to cast off, and maybe I can make an IVD test for that. But then you have the rare disease issue where there might not be a business model around all of these tests. And then another great point that Larry brought up is, and I saw this in a 360 DX article, where vendors may not be, very excited about all of the customer questions they're going to start to get, or the kind of make your instrument work with the FDA now, that they're going to get as a result of this.
So I want to put 2 points forward, that Larry sort of brought up. I think that identifying that sort of patient population that is most likely going to be affected by this ruling is important. It's critical. So we know that around, I believe it's between 20 and 30% of the pediatric IVDs are actually LDTs, and that's going to your sample exclusion, Larry. And then the other thing that you mentioned, Bruce, was that, there are a lot of tests that are currently being developed that we just, COVID's the prime example. That happened so rapidly that it didn't have time to go through, or those types of tests didn't have time to go through the FDA. So if another type of disease like that were to make a prevalence, it would almost, an LDT is going to be the first line of defense that we have in order to appropriately treat that patient population. And again, as we were mentioning before, when it comes to the vendors do have to take that sort of standpoint in saying, well, we can't abandon our customers, but to what degree are we going to invest in a solution that both makes sense for us and also supports not only the patients, but the customers in the long term?
And need we mention that of everything we mentioned in the abstract, I put my market research hat on. And when I hear molecular, immunoassay chemistry not affected, molecular genetic affected, well, what's the growth area for all of those categories for vendors is exactly molecular. When you think about new and fascinating ideas like using next generation for infectious disease, even which Thermo was touting a bit at ADLM, or using mass spec, a lot of that's going to be lab developed tests. So it seems to be hitting hard.
Mm-hmm.
We could go back to lab developed tests, but I want to be cognizant that we could do an hour on lab developed tests and IVD. So maybe we can talk about something and then get back to it. And so what I just wanted to get is I gave some of my ADLM, and Frank gave some of his reaction to the ADLM, former AACC. It's amazing how used I'm getting to that name. It's really starting to stick.
Right.
Bob, Lawrence, reactions to the ADLM, maybe Bob.
Sure. I would say that the ADLM meeting that we just experienced in just a few weeks ago, it's amazing how time seems to fly in our industry, but it's only a few weeks ago, was probably the best meeting since 2019. In other words, we're kind of out of the COVID shadow, and everyone was there, enthusiastic, lots of interesting things to see and booze across the board. A lot of return of point of care, which is reminiscent of any time there's difficulties in the market, people go to point of care. And clearly, we had a great boom of point of care after CLIA 96, and now we're going to have another boom of point of care, in part because we had so much being developed to deal with COVID in particular, and now that's being repurposed in many cases. The interesting thing about ADLM, as most of us know, only a small percentage of the total attendance is laboratorians who work in labs. I mean, there's a lot of people like the four of us who are at ADLM. There are lots of industry people, lots of investment people, lots of M&A. I thought the customers were fairly light as usual, and I thought that they didn't hang around in quite the way they used to. The overriding problems of labor in the laboratories are just overwhelming. I'm seeing people coming into meetings and spending only a day or two when they used to spend 3 or 4. It's just, there's so much to do back at the ranch that people are not taking quite the time that they used to. And if your particular worries are reimbursement and LDTs and labor, I'm not sure that solutions from manufacturers are going to be necessarily top of mind for you.
Interesting. Yeah. Lawrence?
Yeah, I agree. It was probably the most active ADLM or AACC since 2019. 18,000 respondents is kind of where this meeting used to sit. It varied between 18, I think, and about 20,000, depending on whether it drew from Latin America when it was in Orlando or Miami. So that's good attendance. And as you pointed out, of that number, probably there are at best 3,000 to 4,000 that are actually laboratory personnel. The rest are industry players as distributors, investors, etc. And so it's a really interesting and useful market or meeting as a touch point for a lot of us in the IVD industry. I did note, as you did, the prevalence of point of care, and I saw it in two respects. One was the platforms, the infectious disease platforms, molecular and otherwise, that were there for COVID, looking for stability in this market to utilize the placements that were made, and looking for menu expansion to secure those placements, and like the LIAT is a good example. But then I was a little surprised to see all of the clinical chemistry immunoassay rapid benchtop point of care instruments that from companies like Truvian, Fluxigy, Cronus. And these platforms I find interesting because in some cases they are able to have multiple onboard technologies, so they can also do molecular if necessary, immunoassays, as well as the routine stat clin chem. So I think that's a direction and even the big multinationals now, the large IVD companies are looking at these markets a little more closely given the maturity in the routine chemistry market and potential for expansion both at decentralized locations in North American market and in decentralized applications in low and middle income countries. So
I mean, if you could get like a molecular profile or a metabolic profile or a blood count at the time that you're seeing the doctor, and maybe go to the waiting room and wait 10 minutes and come see me and I'll talk to you. That sounds like such a improvement over the way it is now, which even if it's well-intentioned, you'll have even the people who follow up the best, I should say, or have good staff. It's still kind of like I don't know, I'll just give my experience for lack of anything better of, the doctor's kind of giving you either they're the friend doctor or the oh, everything's fine, you look good, or the doctor giving you the horror story. You could have this, you could have that, only to find out, like, a phone call later, like, oh, you're okay, call us in 6 months, and if you could have maybe a Truvian box or something, if that's the right, or whoever emerges from that.
Kind of the key there, though, is to have the breadth of menu so that you're not having to send other tests out. Because if you're going to have to send some portion of the tests out, you might as well send.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And it seems you mentioned the hemolysis for critical care. I mean, that seems to be, that's one of the biggest advances I saw. So we're in agreement there, and we've got a story coming on that in CAP today. And I would mention that as important in and of itself, but it's also generically more important. Manufacturers recognize that chasing down results that are misleading to laboratories that then cause them to increase follow-up testing or reflex testing is something that they really want to get out of the system as best they can. And in a breakthrough like this, in hemolysis permits that. And I think you're going to see more and more the IVD manufacturers focusing on efficiency of testing for the purpose of patient satisfaction and system satisfaction. I mean, if someone has to come back in and be redrawn because there was an erroneous lab result in the first place, that's an enormous waste of money.
Let's talk a bit about PAMA, so that we make sure that we address it, because we talked earlier before we began the webinar about this looming, sort of Damocles that is over the head of labs, and has been for some time, and keeps getting waived. And every time that happens, I kind of feel similar about the IVDR in Europe. Every time it gets delayed, it's like, well, unless you're stopping it, we know this is something you still want to do in the future, but some emergency is preventing you from doing it. And so PAMA hasn't gone away. That's most, is structured to produce a reimbursement cut. Any thoughts about not just PAMA and it, although we could talk about it itself, but also the reaction and the idea of maybe automation as a solution to it? Is it a complete solution, or is it going to be hard for the vendors to answer such a big problem with just like an automation solution? And anyone can answer. Anyone could take that one up that feels like it.
I had a note on this as I was thinking about this session, so I'll go ahead and go first. There is just unshakable confidence in the IVD industry that they are really brilliant engineers. and that they can automate anything, and they can continue to improve their automation for the purposes of serving their customers. You have customers now, of course, who have huge labs and huge networks where they need that kind of automation. And I often ask, are you coming to sort of the asymptotic limit of automation for your operation? Some lab people think they may be there, but in the IVD industry, the confidence remains pretty absolute, I think. Don't you, Larry?
Yeah, yeah, I do. But also it's just another factor in it's forcing more centralization of testing.
Indeed, yes.
Of the talk interest, but reimbursement, LDTs, everything, and lack of shortage of personnel as well. So
right.
That's why we're seeing LabCorp and Quest keep eating up outpatient testing businesses and other competitors.
Yes.
Now,
I think that's something to be fairly wary of, though. So when we are thinking specifically about, the I don't want to say cannibalization, but like the eating up of smaller clinical laboratories, these are laboratories that, again, automation is not really an option for them. So, it doesn't necessarily affect or benefit them in that case. So I think that they're going to be the ones that are more hard hit by this sort of legislation.
could the automation systems even accelerate it? You get a big vendor, better automation systems that are already present allowing vertical distribution of the tubes, for instance, could actually be fueling the ability of a LabCorp to take over more of these big hospital labs.
Right. It's really amazing to realize how many thousands of miles are being driven by courier cars for laboratories, whether you're in IDN systems like Geisinger or Sanford, or whether you're LabCorp or Quest. There are a lot of cars on the road, and there's a lot of planes in the air, all to bring a test tube a couple of 100 miles closer to where we can put it on a hugely automated line and get a result. It's amazing how the sky is filled. I'm always amazed when people start to tell me how many planes they have in the air and how many cars they have on the roads to bring these things in. And yet part of it, of course, is there's a need for automation, there's a need for consistency, there's a need for the test results being absolutely correct and not in error. And that's driving an awful lot of this, and the consolidation as well.
And then the more that the consolidation of laboratories continues, let's look at that from an in vitro diagnostic vendor perspective. I mean, my first thought is it can't be good, but certain vendors it may be very good for them, but it can't be good for the whole industry to have, 2 customers and a few more.
I remember a number of years ago, an area salesperson for a moderate-sized IVD company was talking about how nerve-wracking life really was, because the bids were sort of all or nothing. In other words, you had large IDNs that are saying, we're going to put one brand of box in. And of course, it's going to be a brand that has a box that serves a huge centralized laboratory, a huge core lab, but also can go into a clinic, even a doctor's office, even a 100-bed hospital that's affiliated in there. So you have a different sized units, but all running the same technology with the same sample types and so on. And that gets you to a very few players. And even in the big players, they're constantly filling in the little niche in their brick wall that they don't have a solution for. And we've seen a couple of very, very successful ones with the Siemens analyzer. The CI is one of the conspicuous winners, I think, lately, and was a conspicuous winner at ADLM.
Yeah, and it also it diminishes the turnover time in instrument replacement. One of the things we certainly saw when laboratories started installing expensive automation lines is that they committed to that vendor for the cycle of that automation line, which is probably 10 to 12 years versus the instruments, which maybe are 5 to 6 years. So that installed that vendor with that location for 12 years, not 6. And then when you add to that the standardization of equipment across networks, so that anything that's even not on the automation line is going to be from that vendor, you have very much kind of Siemens or Abbott or Roche accounts across the whole IDN, and you don't see movement in that until a huge contract comes up periodically.
And I think that that's also one of the major reasons why we were stating earlier in ADLM that yes, there was innovation, but it almost seemed like incremental change. When you have this sort of large consolidation, and when you have you've removed almost the competition or the competitive aspect. So there's almost no need to have that degree of innovation in order to put one IVD manufacturer above the other. Because they acquire these large contracts that again last that 10 to 12 years.
That's interesting. And then so what's the answer to that is you go to point of care, where maybe if you build a better box, you can stand out and force that consolidated IDN to buy your system anyway, because the providers are going to be begging for it, and even patients may start to know about it. Point of care to get around that. New types of systems with features.
I always think if you build a genuinely better mousetrap, you will be a winner. The difficulty is genuinely better, not a B2 or our consultants and our research people think it's a much better mousetrap, because our customers are just incredibly sophisticated people. They have memories like elephants. It's rare that you walk into any laboratory and have sort of a fresh customer, okay, who's never heard a sales pitch before, who's never heard of a company before. I still hear from people who say, well, 12 years ago, company X introduced this allergy testing and it didn't work, and I remembered that to this day. And you get those kinds of folks. So that's what makes this such a rich environment to work in. Very, very interesting kind of stuff. And then today, if you do make a better mousetrap, instead of going to Wall Street and growing a huge independent business, one of the big guys, one of the big 6 or 7 is going to acquire you. And just look how that happens left and right all the time.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And should we talk a bit about self-testing? This was, came out of COVID, big trend. A lot of people talking about it, that this is going to go beyond COVID. So testing going directly to the patient, where they're kind of testing themselves. Anybody with thoughts on that?
I think there's an opportunity there. Of course, it's limited by reimbursement. Who's going to pay for it? So it has to be the patient themselves have to be motivated to go to the drugstore and pay for whatever that is. And in the work we've done, there's interest in sexually transmitted infections. There's interested in flu, as in COVID, in anything where you can get a therapeutic. And especially if you need that therapeutic within 48 hours, as in flu, then there's a motivation to do that. But since the government can't reimburse for any test that's not performed in a CLIA lab, then the home is never going to be a CLIA lab. And so unless something changes, I think you're going to see widespread, broad adoption of clinically needed tests. You may see more recreational or more nutritional or health related, health promotion related testing, but not for clinical diagnostics.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, lateral flow is ages old now, and it is still being implemented. They just keep popping more analytes on those strips, but it's not going anywhere. But I don't think that it's going to have that insane boom that we might see with perhaps molecular testing.
We've been sort of waiting for this big boom for a long, long, long time, if you ask me. I mean, we, of course, now if you can get a rapid COVID test you can do yourself, you think it's probably okay. Pregnancy tests, obviously, that's one of the very big winners in the long term. Ovulation tests to some degree, but always remember those tests are simply springboards to getting what a friend of mine in the lab calls a real lab test to confirm the results of the patient self-testing. And some of them are not at all easy to perform. It's not as easy. I'd say pricking your finger is not a natural act if you've never done it before.
think-
I'm going to just absolutely. I always think when I hear about like, oh, the digital testing is easier than oh no, put it in my arm any day of the week. Don't prick my finger. But obviously there's glucose testing where there's a lot of use and people get familiar with it. So I see it. I want to just point out that we do have a question. So a Q&A. So on your Zoom panels, attendees, there's a Q&A. So if you do have a question, write it in there or send a chat, and the experts here will be happy to take a swing at answering your question. And in the meantime, I just wanted to talk about the international market. I'm going to go with the dodgy answer of saying it's mixed. But the international market for IVD, it's mixed, but it's certainly not where when I was doing Kalorama reports in 2014, where the kind of growth numbers where you saw it. But what have you seen on the international scene for selling IVD products? That could be anyone that cares to jump in.
I think if you look at the mature Western economies, they are all looking to cut their healthcare costs. The Germans had proposed a draconian decrease in laboratory test reimbursement coming up, 8 or 9%, I believe. I've seen that. You on the other side, of course, internationally, you have a lot of people paying out of pocket for certain tests. So if you go to Brazil, for example, there's a whole world of pay-as-you-go labs that cater to wealthy folks who want a real high-quality lab. But I'd say international overall isn't the engine that we might have thought it was 10 years ago.
Right. That's what I see as well, or that's what I've seen so far, at least in mine. You would see double digits for China. Right. And China isn't the only one, but that's the biggest growth market it was, the biggest, fastest brick, obviously the leading brick. And I did see, companies, particularly major IVTs, are there. Their business is higher than their U.S. business in most cases. bioMérieux said it's their number 2 country. I do notice that in order to stay there, they have to really be in there. So you can't just sell a few things to China. You have to be building a factory and again, becoming more of like a domestic manufacturer there, as bioMérieux makes its tubes there and other things. Roche has facilities there. But yeah, we're seeing like at best, high single digits where it used to be double digits. And not just China, but Eastern Europe has slowed. India still has a good market. That's always a less domestic competition. Their Middle East, Africa's faster, but yeah, there's been less. All of these international markets, and China will probably be complicated by various tariffs and political battles that go on. But IVD's always done a little better, it seems, than other markets in navigating those things. And I always note that when the Chinese premier came to visit France, one of the first stops was bioMérieux. So that's no accident. These countries realize the value. On China, there does appear to be this push for volume pricing and volume solicitation of bids. It hasn't, as near as I can tell, been national yet for IVD. It has for some like catheters and other medical devices, maybe stents, So the fear is that they're going to start doing that. There has been some provincial volume buying, which has a few smaller IVD, mid-size IVD companies a little scared, because I don't know that Roche gets scared by that. I think they might see it as an opportunity. Others might see it as an opportunity to win those bids. But, you know, yeah, you're starting to see some cost controls there in China, as every place, in addition to the usual like US-China relations issues.
So I want to comment a little bit on what you were mentioning in terms of I guess adoption by other countries. So I think that this really does speak particularly to the role that medical science liaisons play and how they are disseminating information to each of these very culturally different medical environments. And so that's something very much that has to be considered, very carefully navigated. But it's not just a feet on the street sort of problem. It's not like any of the big IVD manufacturers can just go and send 100 sales reps to China and solve the problem. It has to be at the educational level, not only educating the doctors on the technology itself, but educating the doctors on what it means for their organization to actually implement that test and what those outcomes are going to equate to in terms of organizational, I guess, financial balance.
Great points. Great points. So to throw out something else there, what about, we talked briefly about it, that we see maybe there'll be more point of care. Do we think the FDA, we've seen the approval of a STI test CLIA waived, do we think that CMS, FDA are going to sort of lighten up a bit and approve more CLIA waived tests, more point of care tests?
It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen at the agency, with Jeff Shuren resigning and leaving at the end of the year, and many others. So I'd say it's going to be watch this space at FDA to see what kind of new leadership we have, particularly in CDRH. And of course, Tim Stenzel is stepped down as of the spring. So we've got a lot of new players that we can expect to come in, many of whom will have their own ideas around what proper regulation is. And
then anybody else on the CLIA waived? Or else I'll jump to...
I almost feel like I have to, take a hat on or put a hat on and take it off. So I could say, from my personals as a scientist, I would say absolutely. I mean, it is necessary for people to put patient outcomes first. And one way to do that is by bringing the testing closer to the patient and having results faster. Now, putting my consultancy hat back on, I can say that, very much agreeing with Bob in terms of it is a wait and see, that it is not just about the patient outcomes, it's also about the regulations, understanding the risks that are involved with converting or allowing a test to be CLIA waived, and also the impact that it's going to have on particular decisions, because all it takes is one bad diagnosis.
No, great point. Great point. Larry, anything on that? Or
I just think that probably there will be more CLIA waived approvals. I mean, the experience is there, the pathway is there. A lot of companies are going for that
of course,
clearance. So I think just overall it's going to increase, but it may be held back by things you say of hesitancy in terms of what could go wrong. But I think there are increasing roles for CLIA waived devices. And one of the things that we've seen is kind of an interesting application. It's to keep people out of the healthcare system, maybe kind of a resource gateway. In one instance that I found interesting was in preterm birth, that if you could give a pregnant woman a test that she could do whenever she thought she was going into preterm labor, that had a high negative predictive value, that would keep her out of the ER, out of the birthing center, and several days of observation when she goes there, when it's not a preterm birth, and that happens frequently. So there's a huge cost savings for avoiding interaction with the healthcare system based on a home test, rather than getting somebody to care. It's keeping them away from care they don't need.
Right.
So, and there are other applications that I think could be useful in that area.
What about FDA and RUO, or research use only? There seemed to be, right before the LTD rule was announced, a little bit of a uptick in enforcement and a warning letter that went out with a particular product. That is specific one escapes me, but it was big news at the time where they
I
said,
do remember that, but I can't remember the name of the company.
where, it was one
like
of those like wink,
Yeah.
wink, nod, nod. Like they said, hey, you're marketing this as a diagnostic. And the manufacturer said more or less, paraphrasing, yeah, that's what we were. Isn't that the way this works? Like we said, research only, but, and has there been have you noticed more activity on that? Or is that kind of a onesie and then the agency's been busy with the new rule?
I'm finding more companies interested in introducing IUO and RUO products and drawing a very bright line in the claims and making sure they don't get themselves in trouble as a result of that. And of course, you pick company A, B, and C, you'll have 3 different opinions from those companies' regulatory, legal, and compliance departments as to whether this is good behavior, bad behavior, totally unacceptable behavior, or whatever. And but I do think you're going to see more of it, because in part with consolidation, and particularly consolidation within these large academic systems that we all know about. Okay, Northwell, IU, UAB Birmingham Health. You've got a lot of central laboratories where there is what I'd like to call the gray area in diagnostics, where the researcher in his lab may be running a sample for a colleague, and that won't be a diagnostic test, but the colleague will take note of what they get as a result of that. It might influence recommendations on treatment, surveillance, follow-up. And I think that's common. I think it always has been common and is becoming even more so.
There was an ADLM scientific seminar that I thoroughly enjoyed, and it was essentially on, more or less way to say it was using questionable tests. Would you report it or not? And they literally had it set up like a game show where there was a person opposed saying, I would report the results. And she almost did that on every one of these cases. And the other one said, no, I won't report those results, more of a stickler. And then there was a moderator. And then they also interviewed the providers. And it all involved a real test situation. I think a crazy one was like PSA from pleural fluid, or a heavily tainted or heavily diluted ammonia test that was therefore unreliable. Would you still report it out? And while there were some crazy things, like, by the way, that PSA pleural fluid test, I think they surveyed the audience, most of the audience wouldn't have reported it. But the provider wanted it and was insistent. And so in this hospital, they did it. Had a difficulty getting a sample other way was the kind of excuse. And then the other one with the ammonia sample, similar, the provider still wanted it. But I did notice a trend that when they interviewed the providers like, give us the test. You're acting like we're just acting on this one test, but we use a lot of factors in our decision. So, maybe not always, they weren't saying to always report the results, even of a strange test or a questionable test, but to consider you guys less of the, that you're the deciding factor in the lab. We are, and we'll take a lot of information, and base our decision on it. I think we covered a good amount of topics. I guess, though, let's talk about that Roche booth at ADLM.
Oh, yes.
And just quickly, maybe each one of you, if you care to, about Roche's booth and putting mass spectrometry forward in a way that we haven't seen from a big vendor like that.
Well, we remember the Thermo Cascadian episode. I mean, Thermo is certainly a big vendor. Their CEO sat with the Chinese premier when he had a state dinner at the White House. So, I mean, they're not small potatoes. But the Roche booth was of great interest. A lot of people thought you needed an engraved invitation to go into it, but they were very open, and I was surprised at how open they were to let us all see it. Um, and I sort of come away with the notion that if anyone can do it, it's probably Roche, but there is an enormous uphill climb here. And the immunoassay that has really been the hallmark now of 2 generations of the IVD industry, for all its sometimes considerable woes and shortcomings, is pretty much in place and secure. So I'm going to watch that with a lot of interest over the next 3 to 4 years.
It's kind of reminiscent. I don't know, Bob, you probably remember trying to automate radio immunoassay.
Of course, yes.
In the last century, which never succeeded.
Exactly.
And EIA came along and it was highly amenable to automation and took off. So we're kind of in that place. Is this going to take off? Can mass spec be automated in this fashion? And it looks like maybe it can. I mean, Cascadian got close. They just couldn't develop the menu.
Right, right.
And I think that the real promise probably for mass spec is beyond clinical chemistry and immunoassay. It's in proteomics and other multiomics.
It definitely is, yeah.
So the time is right. Hopefully it'll happen.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of interest in cancer diagnostics with mass spec. You can see that at the AACR shows and a few of the more high-tech pathology shows. I mean, I think that's where you're going to see it. It should be of great interest.
I mean, I'm a big proponent of mass spec. I think that it is absolutely going to be the future of diagnostics. However, I do, recognize one limiting factor right now, and this is the, what we keep mentioning in terms of available labor. So mass spec, it will work if you have the trained technicians to run that sort of instrumentation. Automation is going to be key there. Simplification is going to be key there. And so I'm very curious to see how Roche's mass spec is going to be received from a personnel standpoint. How easy is it going to be to integrate that into already existing labs with the talent that is currently there?
Yeah, interesting point. I mean, you're already having labor shortages. Siemens Healthineers did a survey at AD. They released at ADLM, showed 39% of labs have labor shortage problems. That isn't the United States in every industry right now. It was in 2021. Everybody had labor shortages. Go to a restaurant now, generally you have cooks and waiters, but in labs, they're still facing that shortage problem. And then when you get to technical staff, and don't even get us started on the service bills, although for those of us in market research, that creates like a nice large service market for mass spec. a lot of revenue there, fixing it and advising, and maybe vendors are part of that solution eventually, and it gets sold as a service. We'll see.
Let me underscore Frank's point because it runs through every topic we've discussed here, particularly on the LDT side. I mean, we don't have enough people at high levels of experience and technical ability in our clin labs. They're retiring left and right. We do not have enough people even in the industry. I've found the IVD industry now it has a real labor shortage, and they've been reluctant to find people to bring in. I've never seen the departments that are so sparse in their complement of personnel. And then you're looking at LDTs in poor New York State. I mean, you feel like they're going to be surrounded by these pools of people bringing tests to them, and the FDA itself doesn't have the talent. So we're facing a enormous shortfall of that sort of talent, and it's worth bearing in mind for anybody who's contemplating any kind of a venture in diagnostics and laboratories right now.
Great point, and we'll have to have that point. We'll have to end on that point. Bob and Larry and Frank, and all of our attendees, I want to thank you for participating in this. If you attended, you're going to receive an email with the link to a recording we can get a recording of the webinar so you can listen to it again. We can also shoot you over the little slides that we had and all of that. So thanks so much for attending. This won't be the last one of our State of the IVD Industry webinar series. Appreciate the participation, and thanks so much for attending.